Welcome back to the Dean Obeidallah Show. Right now, I can't think of a better guest to have on January 6th on this anniversary than our friend Glenn Kirschner, our former federal prosecutor, served in the U.S. Army in JAG Corps. You see him as a legal analyst at NBC and MSNBC. His YouTube channel, Justice Matters with Glenn Kirschner. Check it out. We'll talk about a brand new interview he just did a few minutes ago. We'll chat about that. So, Glenn, here we are 4 years ago today. We watched in horror as Donald Trump supporters beat police officers, essentially driving some to suicide. There's no doubt about that. Stormed the Capitol, all for Donald Trump, who told them fight or fighting 20 times in a speech, who told them we're going to have someone in the White House who doesn't belong there. We're not going to let that happen. And kept repeating, we're not going to let that happen. They did it, and the man's faced zero accountability. How did the system fail? Or did it not? Was it a person? Was it people? How did we get here? That man who attempted a coup in front of our eyes and cited terrorist attack walks free today and is going to be sworn in as president in 2 weeks.
You know, Dean, we as a society, as a nation, and most pointedly, I think our institutions of government responsible for enforcing the laws of our nation have never done a good job holding the ruling class criminals accountable for their crimes. Those people with power and influence and connections and wealth. This is the pinnacle of that. This is the zenith of that. We refuse to hold accountable a man who launched an insurrection to try to unlawfully retain the power of the presidency, a man who's a convicted felon now about to be sentenced, a man who compromised our national security interests by stealing and unlawfully retaining and refusing to return some of our nation's most closely guarded secrets, for which he was charged with espionage crimes, not to mention obstruction of justice. And we have abjectly failed to hold him accountable. This is one of the darkest days, and I anticipate this will be one of the darkest periods about to descend in our nation's history. And we have steadfastly refused to learn our lessons. We've been smacked in the face with it, and we refuse to learn our lessons. Dean, I wish I could find some hope and optimism that we are going to learn our lessons this time, given what Donald Trump inflicts on the American people as he rules for the next 4 years. But I'm not optimistic we will ever learn our lessons. We will always cater and kowtow to power and money and influence. And that just seems to be the America we've decided we want for ourselves.
It's true. Now, I wanted to touch on this from a human level because you're friends with many of the police officers who were brutally beaten. And I've met some of them because of you. Harry Dunn, Michael Fanone, former Sergeant Gunnell, who wrote a really powerful op-ed in the New York Times. Daniel Hodges, who I spoke to at your party. I've interviewed Sergeant Gunnell and Harry Dunn in the past. From their point of view, when you speak to them, how do they process this? This must be incomprehensible. It must be like a nightmare to come to the guy's going to win. He won. He's going to pardon the terrorists who beat these police officers and beat their friends. And 4 officers took their own lives within a few months of January 6th because of what they went through.
Yeah, I had Harry Dunn a couple of days ago at my studio out here in Leesburg, Virginia, doing a one-on-one interview. And we talked a lot about the trauma that he has suffered, continues to suffer, and our national trauma that we continue to suffer. And Harry, said point blank, he is most disappointed in his fellow Americans who decided to return an abject criminal to the White House. And somebody who has now pledged, as you mentioned, to pardon the folks who nearly beat our police officers to death. As you say, some of them died, some of them took their own lives. Let's be real clear about what people voted for when they cast their ballot for Donald Trump. They didn't vote for somebody who backs the blue. They voted for somebody who backs those who beat the blue. That is the opposite of supporting the men and women of law enforcement. And if he makes good on his promise to unleash these terrorists, these insurrectionists, these folks who attacked the Capitol and the men and women protecting the Capitol that day, I don't know what that will accomplish. I do know Donald Trump will be sending a signal, and it will be a recruiting call. Do this for me over and over again. Violate our nation's laws for me, to support me, to keep me in power, and I've got your back no matter what you do.
Absolutely. It's to incentivize future criminal conduct on his behalf. There's no debating that. What do you expect? Donald Trump has nominated Kash Patel to be FBI director, and Kash Patel not only vowed to go after people in the media, he was also the co-producer of the Justice for All song with the January 6th terrorists. I was just writing about that to remind people. As the New York Times documented, he was a co-producer of that song celebrating the January 6th terrorists. How concerning is it that the FBI is going to be headed by a man who's involved in celebrating the terrorists who attacked our Capitol and has vowed to use his office to be essentially to turn it into a Joseph Stalin-esque type of entity to go after Trump's enemies?
Well, first of all, let's hope he's not confirmed. And let's not forget that the Republicans have been telling Donald Trump no over and over and over again, whether it's Rick Scott, whether it's Matt Gaetz, whether it's raising the debt ceiling, whether it's shutting down government by refusing to pass a continuing revolution. Heck, even DeSantis manned up and said he wouldn't make Laura Trump a senator. They've been telling him no over and over and over again. If ever, one of the most important no's will be the confirmation hearing of Kash Patel. This man has an enemies list. He calls it a deep state list. The Washington Post has called it an enemies list. 60 people, including nearly a dozen Republicans who are the perceived enemies of Donald Trump. And he said, by his own admission, I don't know if they've committed crimes. I'll go after them criminally, civilly. I don't know, but I'm going after them. If there's anybody who is ill-suited to be the director of the FBI, it's a guy with a published enemies list, including people who, by most accounts, have committed no crimes. He even said, I'm going to go after them because they helped Joe Biden commit election crimes. Joe Biden didn't commit election crimes. This person is so ill-suited to be director of the FBI that I hope to hell the Republicans continue to, sprout a vertebrae here and there and tell Donald Trump, no, this man cannot. He is disqualified from being director of the FBI.
I saw an article yesterday where reportedly they're saying Pete Hegseth, who's Trump's nominee for defense secretary, has the votes needed. Does that concern you as someone who served in our military?
It is supremely disrespectful of the men and women in uniform, right? The people who are expected to fight for us, potentially lay down their lives for us. The Department of Defense will be headed up by a guy like Pete Hegseth. You got to be kidding me. How disrespectful and dangerous that is for the men and women in uniform. I hope, again, some senators think better of it because you're now comfortably in office. You've been elected or reelected. You don't have to cater to Donald Trump's most dangerous instincts. You can actually stand up for your own constituents, for our men and women in uniform, for the American people, and for our national security by saying no to Pete Hegseth.
Is there, going back to the pardons for a second, but forward looking, if Trump were to tell Pete Hegseth, as Secretary of Defense, to take some illegal action for him, to help him, use the military to go after opponents, things that you only see in third world countries, and say, don't worry, I can pardon you. That's a valid pardon, isn't it?
According to the Supreme Court, criminal pardons are valid pardons. So what the Supreme Court did in a very real and direct sense is give Donald Trump a blueprint for autocracy. They said any president, a criminally inclined president, can direct his DOJ officials and his military officers to commit crimes against the American people, because those are core constitutional functions, directing your military leaders and your DOJ officials. Nobody can hold a president accountable for urging them to commit crimes, nor can they even inquire about a president's intent or motivation in telling his officers and his DOJ officials to violate our nation's laws, then he can exercise another core constitutional power. He can pardon the military officers and the DOJ officials who follow his unlawful commands to, for example, detain his political enemies without cause, without charges, and without due process. He can then exercise his plenary constitutional power, the pardon power, and everybody gets away with the lawlessness. That is directly and expressly what the Supreme Court gave presidents the power to do. That moves us in the direction of the end of our republic, and it's only a question of whether we will get there under Donald Trump's rule and reign of terror.
I'm chatting with our friend Glenn Kirschner. Glenn, you mentioned the word insurrection a few times. We had the Colorado Supreme Court say Donald Trump engaged in insurrection. We had other officers that are election officers make the same determination. And the Supreme Court, in their case, when they overruled the Colorado Supreme Court decision as to enforcement, they did not overrule the finding that Donald Trump engaged in insurrection. How do you view Donald Trump coming in without the House and the Senate voting by 2/3 to end that disability that is imposed by Section 3 of the 14th Amendment?
That's a violation of the Constitution, plain and simple. You can't read Section 3 of the 14th Amendment without concluding Donald Trump is disqualified. He's not eligible to hold office. However, there's a constitutional mechanism. Both houses of Congress can take a vote. And if they can, whip the requisite 2/3 votes to remove the disability, then he can serve. I don't care about the dicta in the Supreme Court case that said, even though we don't need to reach this issue, so it is dicta, it's judicial rumination. Right. It's a thought experiment. We think it would be a good idea for Congress to pass a new law, which they then chuckled to one another and whispered, we know Congress can't and won't do that. How about that? But we're going to give Donald Trump this added layer of protection. We think they should pass a new law, even though he's an adjudicated insurrectionist by a trial court, by a state Supreme Court. And I would argue that the United States Supreme Court, by its omission, deciding not to disagree with that finding of the Colorado courts, they rubber stamped it. They said, yeah, we kind of agree with it because we're not disavowing it. Not to mention, Dean, Congress already has acted. Congress passed an article of impeachment, incitement of insurrection by a healthy bipartisan majority vote. They sent it to the Senate for a trial, and Donald Trump was voted guilty by a healthy majority, bipartisan majority of the senators. No, not the requisite 67 votes necessary to remove him, but 57 bipartisan senators voted him guilty. Oh, yeah, you engaged in incitement of insurrection. Congress has already acted and announced he incited an insurrection. So they really need to take a vote to remove the disability. But I think we both know, Dean, they won't.
I know they won't, but I agree with you 100% in the way you broke that down, that Congress did act. It's something I wrote about as well for my Substack, that people overlook this. I just had on John Boniface on Friday, who's a constitutional law expert and head of Free Speech for People. And he said, in his view, if Congress does not eliminate the disability, that's the way that the Section 3 talks about it, but essentially the prohibition on Donald Trump serving, that he'll be an illegitimate president. Yeah. And that there's a legal argument to be made that his decisions in the White House are invalid. And he hopes that people do challenge it. Because Congress is not going to do anything. Democrats are not going to do anything. We know that. But do you think there's any potential grounds for that standing to do that, to challenge it?
No. Well, yeah, there's certainly standing to do it. I mean, you could read the Constitution and conclude that that's what must be done, remove the disability. I think we also know that even if it is a political question, a non-justiciable issue, something that the courts shouldn't take up because the Electoral Count Act gives Congress the plenary power to count or reject Electoral College votes. And if they're not regularly given, that's the language of the amended Electoral Count Act. And certainly votes for an adjudicated insurrectionist are not regularly given, they should be rejected. Of course, we all know that even if it is a political question that the courts shouldn't touch, the Supreme Court would touch it and say, listen, We told you before, our ruminations, we think there needs to be new federal legislation. So I do think we'd lose at the end of the day. But as I always told my prosecutors that I supervised, it's more important to fight these righteous battles than to win them, because you can't win the battle you don't fight. I know John Boniface well, interviewed him multiple times on Justice Matters. You know, he and his organization, Free Speech for People, it was founded the day after the Citizens United decision
Wow.
was handed down, and he has been fighting for our democracy and for our people ever since. And my hat's off to John.
You know, when you look at the analysis by and just the dicta, which is the part of the, as Glenn says, it's not the actual holding. It's sort of rumination is the right way of putting it. The court speaking out loud. It worries me that if we get to an analysis of the 22nd Amendment, which says Donald Trump can't go for a third term, does the Supreme Court go, well, unless Congress enacts some legislation? And I know there was a provision, I think Section 5 of the 14th Amendment, that specifically said you need enabling legislation, or they could, not specifically, didn't demand it,
Right.
said you could. I wonder if they go, well, the 22nd Amendment is not self-executing. Congress needs to act. Or will they go, okay, this is so clear, you can't seek a third term? Or they find, will the corrupt Supreme Court find a way and go, well, you know, the framers meant 3 in a row, even though it doesn't say that. You know, that's what concerns me.
Well, everything concerns me because the Supreme Court is no longer an honest broker of the law or the text of the Constitution. As one of our preeminent constitutional scholars, Yale Law Professor Akil Reed Amar, said, in the presidential immunity ruling, the Supreme Court declared that the Constitution is unconstitutional. Take it from him. He knows whereof he speaks. In 2 places in the Constitution, the impeachment judgment clause and the take care to faithfully execute the laws of the nation clause, it clearly indicates a president can be prosecuted, should be prosecuted, even if he is impeached and removed for committing crimes, he can still be prosecuted for those crimes. But whether it's that unconstitutional interpretation of the Constitution, whether it's the non-disqualification of adjudicated insurrectionists, whether it is the Supreme Court ignoring the express text of laws, like in the Fisher case, when it says, if you interfere in a congressional proceeding by using false documents and records, or if you otherwise interfere. And guess what, Dean? Otherwise interfering is attacking the Capitol to stop the certification. And they said, yeah, that's it. Sure, if you take the English language at face value, but that would come back to hurt Donald Trump. So they got rid of that. They just read that out of the law. You tell me, Dean, do we have any faith that the Supreme Court is an honest broker of the law or the Constitution anymore? No. So when you ask questions about whether they might do another solid for Donald Trump and let him take a third term in the Oval Office, why in the hell wouldn't? Because that's their track record, isn't it?
Absolutely. And if Donald Trump's health is there, he will run for another term and he'll challenge it. And Republicans in the party, we'll see what happens. Ambition will get the best of certain Republicans who want to run for president. They don't want to wait another 4 years or 8 years. Who knows how many years? Chatting with Glenn Kirschner. Last thing, Glenn, last 2 quick things. Just moving back to the New York case here with Donald Trump. You know, Justice Marchand on Friday rejected, again, the plea by Donald Trump to vacate the 34 felony convictions. He did say Donald Trump as January 10th sentencing, but did indicate there'll be no imprisonment and some people, or incarceration, and some people are attacking the justice for that. But the justice noted that people are not asking for incarceration anymore. No. And I just wanted to get you to touch on that as a former prosecutor.
Yeah, when you say the people, the prosecutors, Alvin Bragg's prosecutors said, listen, practically speaking, we understand you're not going to stick a president-elect in prison.
Right.
I don't happen to agree with that. I think the punishment needs to fit the crime regardless of the status or the wealth or the privilege or the influence or the connections of the defendant. I seem to be in a minority there. Maybe not in a minority, but certainly the quiet majority. So it didn't surprise me that he said, look, I'm just going to give you an unconditional discharge. What does that mean? It means you've been convicted of 34 flippin' felonies to try to steal a presidential election, but you're going to get no prison time, no probation, no fine, no slap on the wrist. I'm just going to declare this case is at an end so you can now begin to appeal your conviction. You know, it does have the effect of having America ruled or governed, but more accurately, ruled by a convicted felon for the next 4 years. What a proud, proud nation we are.
Have you ever worked on a case where someone was convicted of 34 felonies and received no punishment?
No, I have worked on cases where people received probation, and if they kept their nose clean for a number of months or years, then they would avoid a harsher sentence, whether to jail or otherwise. That's not unusual, but I've never heard of an unconditional discharge, particularly when somebody was convicted of dozens of felonies. It's an abomination. It's the opposite of justice. It's no kind of punishment. And it does a real disservice to the men and women who served on that jury and did the hard work of evaluating the evidence, evaluating the defenses, and holding Donald Trump accountable, you know, by concluding guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. What a disservice it does to grand juries, trial juries, investigative teams, and the people of New York, not to mention the people of the United States.
What would have been a reasonable sentence for Donald Trump in this case, given he has no priors, but they were serious and they were cheating in the 2016 election?
Oh, a year, 18 months in prison. I mean, how can you give no punishment to somebody who violates New York state law, felonies 34 times over to cheat in the presidential election? Seems to me there should be one, punishment, and two, at least some deterrence to others who might choose to go down that same criminal path as Donald Trump went down. Now, I think nefarious political actors are encouraged to commit crimes to try to steal future elections because Donald Trump has suffered not 1 minute of punishment.
And last thing before we wrap up, you mentioned that for your Justice Matters, which you can see on YouTube, you interviewed a prosecutor who was there on January 6th, who DOJ sent, Bill Barr sent to watch what was going on. Elise Adamson
is a former federal prosecutor from the DC U.S. Attorney's Office, and she was responsible for kind of monitoring first the BLM protests in her capacity as a federal prosecutor who was involved in making charging decisions. And then she was sent to the Capitol on January 6th. And she was the only federal prosecutor working that day, boots on the ground. She saw it all. She experienced it all, including the pepper spray and the bear spray and everything else. After being there the entire day with law enforcement, there were people who were arrested on Capitol grounds after they refused to leave, after they cleared the Capitol. Those people were arrested. And Elise was then the prosecutor who represented the people of the United States on January 7th in court to arraign the very first insurrectionists, rioters that were locked up on Capitol grounds on January 6th. And by her account, she said when she saw this unfolding in real time, she called her supervisors at the Department of Justice and said, "This is terrorism, plain and simple." And she had an informed impression of exactly what was going on. I did an hour-long plus interview on my Justice Matters channel. It just posted literally before I signed on with you, Dean. So I'm hoping people will give it a look. It's an important historical perspective from somebody who was there and somebody who has not told her story on air before.
So check it out, Justice Matters with Glenn Kirschner on YouTube. Glenn, thanks so much for your time on this day. I wish you the best. I look forward to speaking with you as we're brothers in this fight to save our republic for the next, how many years it takes.
We'll keep fighting, Dean. It's all we can do.
Take care, brother. Bye.
All right.